Richard, before we get to all the David Copperfield stuff, I want to first ask you to say it ain't so. Say this isn't the last time we're going to hear from Frank Bascombe in this wonderful book you've given us.
Well, John, I think it is. I mean, and the why, I guess, is that I'm 79 years old and I don't want to fall dead at my desk with the book half finished. So, I don't know, it just seems like the right time to me. The last year that Christina and I worked on this book, which is to say from April of last year to January of this year, was really a hard passage for me. And I just thought, you know, this is not as much fun as it used to be, frankly, because what you have to do when you finish a novel is find the right place for every word, one word at a time. And I know it sounds like you're writing sentences all the time and paragraphs all the time, but what you're actually doing is choosing words day after day after day after day. It just got old, frankly. I just thought, well, I've done this for 50 years, and so let that just be enough. I mean, I would write something else if somebody had a good idea.
Well, we can all think of famous athletes, musicians, rock stars who said never, and Tom Brady and Brett Favre and Cher came back.
Right.
They said they would never, so who knows, right? If you had to place a bet, Richard, let me ask you, is Frank at Catherine's house today?
No, he's not. But that's a question it's impertinent kind of question. But since, you know, it's like making a painting. The idea of making a painting is to make the person who looks at the painting not look to the right or to the left, but to look only at the painting. Same, I think, with photographs. With novels, when I get to the end, I don't want you to wonder what's going to happen to them. I think to yourself, this is the end of the book. This is all he had to say. This is all he knows. So I'd have to start writing again to answer that question. Where is he now? Some people say to me sometimes, what's Frank, you're basically asking me this, what's Frank doing when you're not around? And my answer is, he's not doing anything. Because I have to be there for him to do anything. So, you know, he doesn't have a will or a set of discretions to operate on. It's only I who have those discretions. So I guess the true answer is, John, I don't have the slightest idea.
Well, Richard Ford, you were born just a few steps away from where we're sitting now.
Yes.
79 years ago.
Yes.
And what a journey it's been, right?
Yes.
And here we are, one of the most celebrated, decorated writers in America today. In looking back through your biography, you went through in the 1960s what I would call the education period, in which you received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Michigan State University, an MFA in creative writing from the University of California in Irvine. Along the way, met lovely Christina.
When she was 17 and I was 19.
17 and 19. And you mentioned a moment ago about Christina's role in the process, the creative process.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
Well, she's indispensable, I should say, and fair. I would say that about her too. I just write for her, really, is what I do. Because she's a good reader. She reads all kinds of books. She reads books in her own discipline. She reads social science books. She reads novels. She reads thrillers. She reads poems. She reads everything. And those are the people that I want to write for. It's very much like if you were in the last panel. I want to write for anybody who can read, whether they like novels or whether they like poems, whether they like nonfiction or not. And Christina is that person. She's a wonderful reader. So if I can write something that appeals to her, I think that I have a chance to find a wide readership. And then she's also scrupulous as a reader in pointing out things which are not clear, pointing out things that need more of my attention. And and also in saying when something's good. Believe me, when she says that I write something and she says, that's really good, that makes a huge amount of difference to me. It's not just, oh, yeah, well, you like everything I write. But that's not true. I mean, I think she would like to like everything that I write, but sometimes she has to admit that something is not as good as it should be, and she's happy to, she's willing, I would say happy, she's willing to tell me. So, and truthfully, it's just something that we get to do together, and because we get to do it together, it makes life better.
Well, and in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, you entered into what I would call the professional period. You were teaching at a variety of places, creative writing, and
mostly teaching reading. No, I mean,
yeah,
they wanted to be writers, my students at Harvard and at Princeton and for many years at Columbia. But to be a good writer, you have to be a good and faithful reader. And so my job, which is the thing I was better at than reading their sometimes awful manuscripts and telling them that they needed to be better than they were, was to show them wonderful writing and say, here, look at this and see what happens here. And so if you can teach people to read, that's the best thing you can do to teach them to write.
And during that time, you were also writing.
Yes.
And after, 2 novels, a collection of short stories, in 1986 comes The Sports Writer.
Right.
And with The Sports Writer comes the Pulitzer Prize, the PEN/Faulkner Award, one of the few novels to receive both.
Came along after.
And
came in 1995.
In recognition. And so with The Sports Writer, would you have imagined that also would come one day a second novel in 1995, Independence Day, and then The Lay of the Land, Let Me Be Frank with You, and then finally Be Mine, the 5th installment of Frank Bascombe's life? Would you have predicted that at any?
No, I didn't think that I was the kind of writer who had that kind of ambition. I thought that I was the kind of writer who wrote one book and then you exhausted all your resources for that one book, and then you had to go searching around, waiting around for something new entirely to come along. So I had this idea in about 93 or 2 that I would write a book about a man who takes his son to the Baseball Hall of Fame because his son is having behavioral problems as a 15-year-old. And so I sort of began to do what I do, which is to collect raw material into a huge notebook, which usually takes a year before I ever really write anything. And I just noticed that so many of my notes in my general factual outline, which is what I self-flatteringly call it, were in Frank's voice. And I thought, oh, Christ, I can't be writing a book that's connected to another book because I'm not that good a writer. I thought I can't be writing because I'll be just writing the same book over again in hopes of perfecting it the second time I wrote it. And I thought, and plus people will just kill me for it. But I kept finding this voice, these sonorities in my notes, not anything that had to do with Frank. And I finally thought, moron, you're being given a voice. And you're being given a voice in these sentences that people have read before and approved of. Don't fly in the face of destiny here. That you have this voice, use it. And so I just thought, well, okay, then that's how I'll back my way into the ambition of writing connected books. I'm going to write a book because I have this voice. And the voice was a good voice for me because it allowed me to try to be smart on the page, which is always my goal, and also to be funny on the page, which is, if not my goal, it's something I can almost always do, because I thought that if nothing's funny, nothing's serious. And I thought what I wanted to write about was a father trying to revive his son to be a more useful citizen and to be, between the two of them, a good pair of loving friends. And taking him to the Baseball Hall of Fame, I thought was a serious kind of subject, which would allow me at the same time to write something that was funny. So that's all, as I say, it's always my goal.
And then Paul and Frank team up again for another road trip.
Yes.
The latest installment.
Yes.
How was this interaction between father and son different in Be Mine than in Independence Day?
Well, I mean, in the main, they're older. Frank is 70-something, and Paul is 40-something, 47, 45. Fortunately, I'm getting far enough away from the book that I forget those details. And Paul has ALS, and his father is trying to find a way to give his son a kind of a victory lap. And after he's come to the point where he knows he's not going to get any better, but is only going to get quickly worse. And so that's different. The whole business of sort of aging characters, is not probably as complicated as it seems, because these are not real people. I don't have to really age them. All I have to do is just on the page, using sentences, attribute to my characters, these instruments, which characters are, qualities which I think are apt and apposite to their age group, and that are consonant with the things that I have known about them before. So it's much less complicated to write characters than it would be to make another human being. So that's sort of where the difference is. Making Frank be 73 or 75, whatever he is, whereas when I first wrote about him he was 39, it's not that hard to do. I mean, writing novels is not that hard to do. I mean, if writing novels was that really hard to do, believe me, I, who grew up down the street here, would not be able to do it.
Well, you speak of Paul having ALS. What type of research did you have to do, Richard, to get the details of that right? Because so many people have commented that you really, nailed with great accuracy the depiction of Paul having ALS.
Well, I think I said when we talked yesterday, I didn't have to get everything right. I just had to be sure not to get everything wrong. Because people who have ALS are not just specimens of ALS. People who have ALS are human beings. They have all the same desires. They have the same memory. They have the same wishes. They have the same emotions as anybody else. So having a person on the page have ALS was not as big a hurdle as would seem, which isn't to say that I didn't read some books. I read some books, and I also finally availed myself of a neurologist at the Mayo Clinic who I could write notes to and say, did I get that right, or was that just wrong? And he was kind of reluctant, and I don't know why he was so reluctant, because he volunteered to do it. So consequently, I haven't sent him the book. I can buy the book if he wants to. Because I don't want him to write me and say, oh, you really, that's not right. So I was just trying to create as much a character as I could, not just a character who had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, just a real, as much as the page can contain, as real a character as I could.
And speaking of the characters, who in these books would you most identify with personally?
All of them. All of them, I would say fairly enough. But I don't really identify with any of them. I just use myself, my memory, my whatever vestiges of imagination I have left, to make these characters up as much out of whole cloth. In fact, I think, John, when I find myself agreeing with something one of my characters thinks, I think I've probably fallen down on the job, that I haven't embedded them colorfully enough or interestingly enough for them just to agree with me. How poor that seems.
Have any of the characters, and I'm thinking about Frank in particular, surprised you? Because this is a...
No, characters don't surprise me. Characters don't surprise me at all. I surprise me sometimes, but they never surprise me. They haven't, as I say, they have no volition. Sometimes I'll write something and I'll think, wow, that's really remarkable, but I never say, thanks, Frank, for giving me that. I just usually shut down for the day and go have a drink. You kind of have to sort of self-psychologize yourself whenever you do something really well on the page and you think to yourself, I did that really well, and I'll come show it to Christina, and then I'll usually just stop at that point and think to myself, this is a moment to savor rather than just sort of plowing it under and going on to the next paragraph that you write, which will probably be not as good and sort of blow that good feeling that you had out of the water. So you have to just kind of, juke yourself a little bit this way and juke yourself a little bit. I mean, all of the ways that I talk about writing fiction is I think you understand, and as Christina understands too, is to try to make it clear to other human beings that they could do this if they wanted to. I just happen to have nothing else to do. But my whole bent as a teacher at Columbia all those years was to make it seem not mysterious. It's one of the things that Nat said in the last in the last panel that Bob Silver's he demystified in many ways being a good journalist or being a good literary writer. And I want to demystify being a novelist because nobody ever discouraged me. Nobody ever said, you're just a little nitwit who shouldn't be able to write these things. Because nobody ever said it to me, so I never thought it. I just thought, okay, I'll do that.
Well, in teaching writing and in thinking about structuring the novel, especially one like the Frank Bascombe series, some teachers would say, well, it's important to have a character with a clearly defined goal who wants something, and then we have to set obstacles in her path, and she has to defeat each of those obstacles. So we can easily think of the dragon coming, and we need to slay the dragon, and those kinds of things. What's our clearly defined goal in the Bascombe novels, if there is one, and what are our obstacles that are in the way? Have we abandoned that structure entirely?
Well, we never embraced that structure to begin with. My goal is to always write about the most important things I know, because I think if I'm writing about the most important things I know, that will support any structure I can come up with. As far as the obstacles are concerned, the obstacles are what's between this ear and that ear. The obstacle is me. Can I do it well enough? Because I don't have a notion of what novel structure is. I think I'm a novelist. If I write a story and I call it a novel, it is ipso facto a novel, because there's no primer for writing novels, really. That sort of superstructure that you described maybe would work for someone. But I just never even knew it when I was starting to write long books in the early 70s. So it was never really a feature that I could choose to do. But I know it exists now, and when you say it, I kind of recognize it. But my goal is basically to write one good sentence followed by another good sentence followed by another good sentence, and when I get 50,000 of those sentences in place, I'll have a novel. And it'll be good because each sentence is good.
Well, do we see, though, an arc or a state of some type of progress in Frank's life from the beginning, the inception in The Sports Writer up through Be Mine?
Well, progress. I mean, I don't particularly believe in the progressive view of history, that things, as I think we all can look around us and see, it doesn't work out very well. Here we are, right here, right? So probably just continuity is what I have been aspiring to, or the illusion of continuity. I mean, I don't believe, I'm not sure people change. They might. They get older, their bodies change, their mind deteriorates, or sometimes gets even sharper. But I don't know, it's a received notion that people change. I don't generally work with received notions. If somebody says a question like that, as you asked me, and you as a lawyer would know this, my goal is to go to the opposite extreme, which is to say people don't change, people don't progress. And therefore, what does that allow me to be able to write on the basis of that presumption of my own? So if anybody ever asks me to trust something that they say, I always think, well, that might be right. I never think, yes, that's right. I always try to turn everything on its ear so that I think, well, maybe in fact the opposite is true. And that is true both as a personal philosophy and a personal morality, really. And it's also true because when I turn things on their ear, presumptions and conventional wisdoms, then it gives me something to say. And most people who write novels and write poems and write essays are basically looking for something to say on the basis of what they have experienced.
Well, do you think a reader, though, who reads all 650,000 pages of the Bascombe books or listens to 120 hours of audible recordings and emerges from that immersive experience thinking, well, I see a glimmer of hope for Frank Bascombe. I see him, he's softening up a little bit, and maybe that's the product of his aging. Maybe that's the product of the unfathomable loss he encounters and eventually coming to terms in more healthy ways with that loss. Maybe we see some improvement in his overall condition and his ability to be happy. Do you think a reader's just wishfully thinking if she sees that?
Possibly. But I do think a large measure of what the reader thinks when he or she comes to the end of any novel has to do with what that reader's belief system is, and irrespective of what is encountered on the page. For me, who's filling those pages with sentences and words, when I get to the last movement of a book, which is to say, in that book, the second happiness section, there's an au revoir at the beginning, which is called happiness, and then there's one at the end called happiness. I ask myself, when I get to the threshold of writing the end movement of the book, I ask myself, what can I say that's redemptive? What can I say that redeems this experience? And I'm not talking about putting the good mouth on something. I'm just trying to say, what can I write in these sentences that will allow the reader to leave the end of the book and think that life is worth living still?
And you're satisfied that in Be Mine, in the ending, you've achieved that?
I'm satisfied I did my best.
A very lawyerly answer.
No, well, I'm sure it's better than a lawyerly answer. I wouldn't be here now if it was a lawyerly answer.
Well, and we're fortunate your legal education didn't take, Richard. We're very fortunate.
I fell in love instead.
Well, we're all the more fortunate. The world did not need another lawyer. It needed another fantastic novelist. And Mississippi's all the more grateful for that. I want to ask you, speaking of your being a Mississippi writer, so in most libraries across the state, those of you who grew up here, you know there is something called the Mississippi Writers section, right? At what point did you form an opinion that you were going to put a book on that shelf? And did you say, well, you know, I think I'll put something between, I don't know, The Sound and the Fury and The Glass Menagerie? How does one formulate that?
By not thinking that. By thinking that literature has to go on, and to be presumptuous enough to think that I can at least try to push its little marble a little farther down the line. We're all standing on, those of us who write novels and those of us who do artistic things of any sort, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And that what we should do is take comfort and take encouragement from the work of Eudora, Welty, and William Faulkner, and Richard Wright, and Dr. Alexander. So it's, even though it seems presumptuous, it's not really very presumptuous. And so I just thought to myself, I'm just this one individual. Christina thought it was a really good idea, which was the most important thing. When we were just about to get married, and we were in my mother's apartment in Little Rock, and I didn't have a job, and I just left law school, and she said to me, you know, we're going to get married in about 2 weeks. She said, what are you going to do with yourself? Perfectly reasonable question for a young bride to ask her husband-to-be. And I said, and I could have easily said, I think I'm going to be a small engine repairman. But I said, I think I'm going to try to write stories. And she said, oh, good. She said, that's a really good idea. She said, you stay home and write stories, and I will go out into the world and get a job. And she did, and I did, and that's basically what we've been doing ever since. So it was never a matter of sort of saying, where am I going to fit into this, canonical shelf of books? It was just that I would write this book, and it would be as good as I could write, and it would have the life it had. And I thought that because I was from Mississippi, and Mississippi gave you some license to be a writer. I mean, we lived in the same town as Eudora, Welty. You had that license sort of floating in the air around you all the time. I would write a book, and that would be fine, because people write books, and it would find the place it had. But to me, the most interesting thing about writing that first book was that I thought I could write new things set in Mississippi, maybe about Southern characters, and I found that I really wasn't very good at it because people had done it better than I could do it already. I mean, Eudora had, Faulkner had, Richard Wright had, all kinds of people had. So I had to go off into the world and find something that I could be the world's greatest expert in, which turned out to be these books.
In your relationship to places like New Jersey?
Yes, and New Jersey was great because we had lived there 3 or 4 years, but in the process of living there 3 or 4 years, we traveled all over every place in New Jersey, every inch of it for some reason. I don't know why we did. We kind of liked it. I still love it. And I thought, this is a place that everybody thinks looks like the back of an old radio, but in fact, I think is a wonderful place to set a novel because it had, for instance, all of these great place names. I mean, think about all of the place names in New Jersey. Ramapo. Every time I put Ramapo on the page, I feel a little flutter in my chest like that, So it had a great storage of language, and it had the advantage of me trying to reverse a certain kind of set of presumptions about the place, which is that it's not a good place to live, and I had Frank Bascombe to say, in fact, it is quite a good place to live. And when you have that advantage of having something to say, as I said before, then you have the makings of a book. I don't mean you'd have the whole book, but you have some of the presumptive tissue that the book will be made of.
Well, and the place also becomes almost a character in the book, or at least not just the place, but your description of modern contemporary America. Can you tell us about that and the importance to the overall theme of the book?
Well, it's not very important to me. What's important to me is what the characters do in the foreground of the book. All of those Ramapos and Colts Necks and all those places where people live in New Jersey were I thought a wonderful background for what I wanted my characters in the foreground to do. So it was never that I wanted to write about the state of America in 1984 and in subsequent years. That just sort of came along in the way that I filled in the background of what the characters were doing in their intimate lives. I mean, my presumption about writing what are basically, we're talking about political novels, and I think to an extent these are political novels, is that there's nothing this is in the beginning of Felix Holt, George Eliot's novel. She said that there's nothing that human beings do in their private life that has not been predetermined by a larger public life. So I think if I can make what people are doing in their intimate lives interesting and compelling, that those events will radiate out to the larger polity and will be ipso facto political in their nature. Those intimate lives will be political lives for that reason. And that's my fundamental belief that not that all things are political. Many things are not political at all. But in the main, our lives are somewhat determined by the larger political environment that we live in. And it is useful for us to realize that, particularly in making individual kinds of decisions.
Well, and not to spoil the ending of Be Mine, and again, I encourage, if you hadn't read it, to read the book.
That's okay, you can spoil it.
Tell us a little bit about Frank's episode of what you describe as global amnesia toward the end of the book.
Well, well, I had an episode of global amnesia, and it was Christine and I lived in Maine for 24 years, and I was one night going to take the garbage out because the garbage truck would come before I woke up the next morning, so I had to get it out the night before. And I went out to get the garbage cans, and somebody had already taken the garbage cans out, and that was me. But I absolutely had no memory of it at all. I mean, it was just etch-a-sketched. I came in and I said to Christina, I said, who took the garbage can out? She said, well, I saw you take it out. You walked out the door with the garbage cans out. Well, I had no memory of that. So as I always do, I went straight to the Mayo Clinic. And they said, well, yes, you have had an episode of global amnesia. You're only really allowed one of these, but you probably will never have another. And so that's the kind of thing that when I realize it has happened to me, I want to slam it in a book. I just want to say, this is interesting. And so I saved it to the end of the book. I saved it to the end of the happiness section of the book, in which Frank has an episode of global amnesia in which he goes out onto the veranda of the house where he's living in California and basically kind of phases out because he remembers the sun there, and when he next sees the sun, it's down here. And he just thinks, where have I been? But he hasn't been anywhere, he's been there. So I thought it was good.
Well, it's certainly a contrast to Frank's very constant attention to the world around him that we hear so much about. And then suddenly he's not aware of the world around him.
All I can say about that is that's right. But I don't know. But it isn't meant to mean anything. It's just meant to have happened in the reader's presence, and for the reader to make of it what she or he can make of it. Because then life, after he has this episode, and Christina told me later on she read in the New York Times that people actually have more than one of these, which is a little terrifying. But that's Frank's second one that he's had. So he's had another one, and he says, you're only allowed one of these, he says, so that tells you something about where I am at this point in his life. But then after he returns to sentience and awareness, then life goes on, which is basically the reason the last part of this book is called Happiness, because at the end of it, life carries on, in spite of the fact that he's lost two of his children and has lost two wives and doesn't like his daughter very much.
Well, and speaking of his daughter, Clarissa, tell us about his relationship with her. And
Well, I don't want to do that. You have to read the book to do that. I mean, because I don't want to say in 25 words or less what it took me 40 years to write.
well, let me ask you this way:
Okay.
as a writer, did you have a sense of frustration with their relationship? Or?
Absolutely not. No, because they didn't have a relationship. I made that relationship. It would not frustrate me when I make it. I made it to be frustrating, but it didn't frustrate me. It frustrates him sometimes because he doesn't like her very much, and she's kind of nasty-spirited. But in spite of all, they managed to find a way, and this is such an important thing to me. They find an important way to say, I love you, in spite of all. In spite of her frustrations with him and impatience with him, in spite of his with her, in spite of his sons adoring his sister, and when Frank is taking care of him, if I can find a way in books to have one character say, I love you, well, then I think I've done a good thing, and mean it and have it be persuasive. But it never frustrates me. No. The only thing that frustrates me is when I can't think of a good line, or I can't think of a good word, or when I've written a paragraph that has too many words in it and I don't want to take any of them out. That frustrates me sometimes. But what the characters do never frustrates me.
What do you think is a weakness in your writing?
weakness in my writing? I don't describe people's faces very well, and I wish I did. And I use little cheating things to describe people's faces, such that I'll compare someone's face to the face of someone that everybody in the audience would know. I remember in the writing Independence Day, I had a view of the Markham characters who were looking for a house in central New Jersey, and I just couldn't figure out any words that would describe Markham, the father here. And so I said that he looked like the actor Bob Hoskins. And I knew what Bob Hoskins looked like. And I thought, yes, he looks like Bob Hoskins, exactly. But that was a complete failure on my part to be able to say what he actually looked like. And so I think that's something that I routinely struggle with a lot. And I'd like to be able to think that it's because I don't really care what people look like. But in fact, I do. And I would be really happier if I could do it better. And so that's one thing I don't do very well. Another thing that I don't do very well is in a long paragraph, sometimes I'll fall in love with a sentence. It will sometimes frustrate me wanting to fall in love with it, because knowing that I have to take it out, because it's nobody else is going to fall in love with it but me. So I usually manage, with Christina's help, to get that out of there. So in other words, if I write a long paragraph that I really like, I don't want to take stuff out of it. I want it to stay the way it is, but so I have to struggle to take it out. I mean, not just to take it out like pruning a shrub. You take things out of a paragraph so that the reader will fasten on to the more important things in the paragraph and get the persiflage of things like that out of the way.
And what are the aspects that come naturally to you that you think are just automatically gifted at?
I think I'm a good premise finder. I think I find good premises for books. That is to say, I'm going to write a novel about a man who's taking his dying son to the Mayo Clinic and then onward to Mount Rushmore. I think that's just a great premise for a book. Because it's a great premise for a book because it's about the most important things that can be, and it has lots of lenience in it for variety. So I think I'm pretty good at that. I'm dogged. I've only ever tried to write one novel that I didn't finish, and I'm not quite sure I'm not going to finish it. It's a book I tried to write before I wrote Be Mine. And I think I'm a really good writer of dialogue. I think I can make sentences on the page sound in the reader's ear the way human beings sound. Those sentences that I write dialogue for in novels, they don't play well if you actually have people say them on the set of a movie. I mean, I think I write literary dialogue, and so that when actually actors try to say them, it sounds not very good. So that's why I'm not a rich screenwriter. But I think that on the page, that I'm good at making people sound for the reader's ear the way they think people sound.
What do you think the major differences are, though, if you were to try to do a screenplay?
Well, I think the major differences are that I try to go from strength to strength to strength to strength, line to line to line to line, and it turns out to be heavy when someone is saying them on a movie set. And they sound ponderous on a movie set, whereas on the page, pages are very forgiving in all kinds of ways. You have all kinds of other things you can look at on the page, all kinds of other things going on. And so if I can measure the importance of one line against the importance of another line, I think that's the biggest difference. Whereas in movies, you know, it's what you see on the screen in a movie that's the most important thing, and the dialogue is kind of subordinate. For me, the dialogue is never subordinate. It's when people speak on the page, they come as close to being like human beings as they will ever come on the page. That is not true when you're writing something for somebody to speak on a movie set.
And when you're writing, Richard, give us an overview of what your process is, and does that differ from where you are, you know, in the the process of writing a novel?
My process is, it's just almost too tedious to express. For a year, I collect all this material in this big fat notebook with dividers like a high school kid's notebook. One divider will say Frank, one divider will say Paul, one divider will say Minnesota, one will say North Dakota, one will say all of these little categories that I invent. And I just fill them full of all the stuff I can dream up for a year. And then every week, I read through the entirety of it. And in what I do, I read through the entirety of it, and I copy things down on 3x5 cards for each day's work, for the next 5 days' work. And I go through those 3x5 cards day after day after day after day. And then I'll go to the end of the week, and I'll go through that notebook again. It's a clerical hell. But it's the only way I can do it. I dreamed this up back in 1982 because I was writing novels, those two first novels that you mentioned. I was writing novels that I felt did not get myself fully expressed. When Updike died, Adam Gopnik wrote a piece in the New Yorker, and one of the things he extolled John for was getting himself fully expressed. And what that meant to me and means to me, and it probably meant the same thing to Updike, it's not that I use novels as a mode of self-expression. I do not. I don't need novels as a mode of self-expression. I can say what I want to think. But getting fully expressed means to use all the material that I have and of myself, all of the material that I know and dream up to be useful. I was writing in those first two novels work that did not get myself fully expressed. And I had a great friend named Walter Clemens, who was the book review editor for Newsweek magazine. And when he read the second book I wrote, he said, Ford, he said, you've got a great sense of humor, but none of it's in this second book. And I thought, well, shit, I have got to find a way to be sure that all of the things that I can do, I take advantage of on the page. So that's basically it. That's why I accumulate all this material and immerse myself in it continuously for 4 or 5 years, so I can get everything that I know is important, everything that I think the reader would be interested in, would like, would delight in, would be edified by onto the page.
And then does at some point that begin to get transferred onto a computer or?
Yes, it does. But I write it all in longhand. I write novels in longhand, always have. I write all stories in longhand, write all essays in longhand, write everything in longhand. And then ultimately, I, in my feeble way, type it on files and read it.
So you mentioned you're working on a novel, or you might pick back up a novel. Sneak peek?
Nope, it's boring. That's one of the reasons I quit writing it. I wrote the first chapter, and I thought this is the best first chapter I ever wrote in my life. And the second chapter was slightly less good. And the third chapter was slightly less good than that. So I ended up with about 5 chapters of diminishing interest to me. So I just said, okay. At the time, I was about 71 or 2 years old. I thought, shit, I don't have to prove anything to anybody. I can just set this aside and go on and do something else. So I did.
So do you believe that you are fully self-expressed in your...
In these books, like I said before, if somebody had a good idea, I would try to write it. But I'd have to have it myself and have to believe it myself. When I started writing this book, I was in the back seat of an Uber taxi in Washington, D.C. with a Republican novelist. Believe that is a friend of mine. A great guy. And he said, Ford, he said, what you ought to do, he said, you ought to write a book set at Valentine's Day. And I said, right. I said, and I would call it Be Mine. So if I had another Sistine Chapel moment like that, I would certainly try to, paint the ceiling with it.
Well, we're eagerly awaiting that time. So during your book signing of The Sports Writer, I think it was, you had an important visitor attend your book signing.
Oh, yeah, at Lemuria. Must have been in 1986. Lemuria was at the time across on the other side of the interstate, and not in Banner Hall where it is now. And I was just there doing gratefully what I was happy to do, which is to have a little book event at Lemuria. And I looked up and there was Eudora, for Christ's sake. And she said, never forget what she said. She said, I just had to come pay my respects, she said. She had a very deep voice, as we all know. And it was a wonderful moment for me, because I had written 2 novels prior and sent them both to her, which caused her to say nothing. So I heard that nothing. So I didn't send her this book, but she actually bought that book herself and came and she said she read it. When people say they read it, that's all they have to say to me. They don't have to prove that they've read it. So she said she'd read it, and she came to Lemuria and she got me to sign her book. It was really a wonderful moment. I fortunately have a picture of that, which I cherish.
Fantastic. Anybody have any questions out there? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Hey.
I'm also an English teacher, and I
Thank you for doing that.
have a 2-part question.
Okay.
Number one, you said something that Ernest Hemingway also said is you only have to write 1 true sentence. And so I wondered, A, was Ernest Hemingway on your reading list when you taught? And B, can you share the reading list, or is it online somewhere that I could go and look it up?
I can send it to you. I surely read. Hemingway was not on my reading list. I mean, I read Hemingway when I was, like most boys, 18. And I think Hemingway is basically writing for post-adolescent boys. The sentences are too short. He skimps on experience and he skimps on language and he cuts a lot of, as far as I'm concerned, emotional corners that don't really help very much. And when you grow up down the road from Faulkner, as I did, who's lavish with language and makes you think that the reason people read literature is to be exposed to well-chosen language. And because I think readers, certainly I hope my readers, read it 1 word at a time, and that's the great pleasure. That's where the rubber meets the road for readers, language. And the Hemingway didn't give me enough. He just didn't give me enough. I loved it when I was 18. So, and maybe if, I don't want to for any reason say you shouldn't read it. I just don't read it anymore. And I quit reading it when I was about 21. But that's fine. He was what he was and he did what he did and God love him for it. But he didn't make much difference to me. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I guess, I mean, most American male white writers always get compared to Hemingway. Usually, no. You're missing my point. You didn't. You're missing my point. That's not the point. You just asked me if I read him, and I did, and I told you why. But he's just kind of a whole cloth measure for a certain generation of writers, and you get kind of used to it, and it stops meaning anything to you. No, don't do that. You didn't do anything wrong. You just asked me a question, and this is the answer. But I will afterward. I'll give you a reading list of things which I used at Columbia for all the years I taught there. And it's got Naipaul in it. It's got Virginia Woolf in it. It's got Ford Madox Ford in it. It's got wonderful stuff in it. And don't think the wrong thing. So. Yes.
So I just was interested to hear your personal experience with the reading life. Were the writers that affected you throughout your life, or what were some reading lessons you remember teaching back then?
Well, I mean, the first novel that I ever read to the end of, other than Freddie the Pig, okay? The first serious novel that I ever read to the end of was Absalom, Absalom. And that was just like swimming across the ocean for me. Because it's dense and it's replete and it's various and it's wonderful. For me, the great 20th century American novel. But that's where I came to understand that what reading is about is words. And that the pleasure that can be got just simply, as Donald Barthelme says, from a hard, brown, and nut-like word, just to engage language in that way was for me a huge revelation, because I grew up probably as many people grow up. You grow up thinking that novels are interesting because they mean stuff. I thought novels are interesting because they're made of words, and that words are the things we use all day, every day, and most of the ways in which we get into trouble in the world is when we don't use them very well, or when we use them poorly, or when we use them excessively, in some way, you know. And so literature in that way, as a moral dictum, shows you the use of language in a way that is not necessarily responsible, but that is accountable. So that was important to me. The other thing that, and I sort of learned this more from Sherwood Anderson, that literature was a place as a reader that I could go. Because I grew up thinking sort of the old sort of Peggy Lee song, is that all there is? Living out on Meadowbrook Road, I thought, is really? And when I started reading literature, I thought, no, there is another world, and it is in this world, as Paul Eluard says. And so to teach young people who want to write that what you are offering the reader is another world, but it is in this world, encourages a certain sense of responsibility for where you take the reader when you take her or him somewhere. So that was important to me.
So to follow up on that, you touched on this, but writing is the intersection of the story and the language, right? You've got a story to tell, you've got the beautiful words used to express that story. Has your emphasis on one or the other evolved over the years as you have moved forward in your career? In other words, has language become more central, or has storyline become more central, or how have you integrated them to get to the place where you are?
If that balance which you describe is true, and I'm pretty well willing to believe it is, not every writer would agree with that particular balance, as you understand. Kenneth Patchen, for instance, would not agree with that. But maybe Faulkner wouldn't agree with that either. But I think that balance has stayed pretty much stationary from the time I started to now. I think I've gotten a little bit more demanding on myself in choosing words, and I may have gotten a little less worried about the story aspects of it. If you think that the story aspects of it, to so use Forster's analogy, is different from the plot. Forster, in aspects of the novel, talks about story and plot, and it's very hard to figure out how he distinguishes those things, but they are distinguishable, I think. So I think the story aspects of it probably have diminished a little bit but they don't disappear. They just have diminished a little bit in favor of language.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Writers under the age of, say, 50.
Oh, I don't want to do that. I'll leave out the most important person. I'm not going to do that. Whoever you're reading is best. Because I will. Like I said, I have a mind like a colander. And so I will forget the most important person that I should forget, then I'll punish myself the rest of the day. So better if I just zip it up.
Richard, toward the end of Be Mine,
Yeah.
which I highly recommend,
Thank you.
there is a passage here that talks about Frank having no further need for the old German Nazi Heidegger, as he calls him. And it put me in mind of thinking about my old philosophy classes in Heidegger. And in, I think, the early 1960s, he was making a speech, and someone asked, well, how do we live a more authentic life? And Heidegger said, spend more time in graveyards. And that made me think of a sports writer, because in the sports writer, y'all might remember, we begin in a graveyard, literally. And Frank begins to read a poem that he doesn't finish, and he's unable to finish the poem. And this is from Theodore Retzky's work, Meditation. And I was put in mind of Theodore Retzky's work because I studied under a man you know, Roland Flint, in college, who was a Theodore Roethke devotee and had done his dissertation on the work of Theodore Roethke. And so I fished this book out, and I was wondering, in an effort to commemorate what you have accomplished, which is without question one of the great achievements in American literature, the Frank Bascombe series, if you could perhaps share with us the stanza from Meditation that Frank Bascombe wasn't able to complete in the cemetery that day.
If you'll let me say how I ever got there to begin with, I had Frank and his wife, who is only referred to in this book as X, in this cemetery to visit their son's grave. And I thought that was a wonderful place to set a scene, but like all wonderful places to set a scene, then you have to make something happen there. And maybe you don't know what to make happen, so you have to dream up something. And since his wife is from Michigan, and Ted Roethke was from Michigan, I thought it would be appropriate that maybe she, at the grave of their son, recite a poem, or Frank recite a poem, one of them recite a poem that Ted Roethke wrote, because he went to the University of Michigan, and Ann Bascombe went to the University of Michigan. So I dredged it up because it had a Michigan connection. It had nothing to do with the literary aspect of it. I just wanted a Michigan something. And so this wonderful poem of Roethke's, which I wish you would go home and Google up and read. It's called Meditations of an Old Woman, and these stanzas are meditations. And the last one, which Frank tries to recite, is this. I think I can do this. I have gone into the waste, lonely places behind the eye. The lost acres at the edge of smoky cities, what's beyond never crumbles like an embankment, explodes like a rose, or thrusts wings over the Caribbean. There are no pursuing forms, faces on walls, only the motes of dust in the immaculate hallways, the darkness of falling hair, the warnings from lint and spiders, the vines graying to a fine powder. There is no riven tree or lamb dropped by an eagle. There are still times, morning and evening, the cerulean high in the elm, thin and insistent as a cicada, and the far Phoebe singing the long plaintive notes floating down, drifting through leaves, oak and maple, or the whippoorwill along the smoky ridges, a single bird calling and calling. A fume reminds me drifting across wet gravel. A cold wind comes over stones. A flame intense, visible, plays over the dry pods, runs fitfully along the stubble, moves over the field without burning. In such times, lacking a God, I am still happy.
Richard Ford, great Mississippian, great American.